you. All right, well, happy Ash Wednesday, everyone. Today we will talk about colonialism. Well, we are, actually. Today's topic is algorithmic colonialism. And this is actually taken from a talk that I've been doing in a paper I've been working on with this one student. And it's about the spread of technology, but also the spread of the values of technology, the values that we build when we build the technology from the perspectives, that we come from. And so we've touched on this in the notion in week one about data, how it's shaped, how it's formed, and also last week when we talked about who we value as an individual, and how we use our public spaces in order to prioritize individuals or provide services or products, but in a sense, in a way that is geared towards a particular type of individual, at least in the current iteration of a smart city. So today's talk is about algorithmic colonialism. And I've used a lot of Western-centric and particularly US-centric examples, and sometimes I do that on purpose, because when people talk about the dangers or ills of technology, it seems to be something happening elsewhere, namely China. And people love to talk about all the quote bad things, the social credit score, et cetera, happening in other places, in other countries, and again, namely Asian countries. And I like to use Western examples because we are also using these technologies in very, very similar ways. But this talk, I also wanted to talk about the spread of technology in the global South and what that means. So in the global South is actually the most booming and growing tech economy in the world. So we have billions of dollars being poured into different countries in Africa. There's massive markets in India, massive areas for growth in Central and South America. But in South Asian countries and African countries are where a lot of the growth is concentrated and centered. So a book I would recommend by a colleague of mine, Kyle Aurora, it's called The Next Billion Users. I highly recommend it. It's a perspective on how individuals in the global South adopt and use technology from their cultural perspectives. Like, for example, cab drivers in India using YouTube or WhatsApp, or how is it understood and utilized from their perspective. So technological investment is booming in the global South. We see rapid rises as actually a lot of these nations become more and more wealthy. And what's happening is that the infrastructure of these nations in particular, I'm going to focus a lot on African countries in this talk, because that's where we're seeing most of the investment happening by China. So the Made in China 2025 plan was a plan to dominate cutting-edge technological industries, and they have a 2030 goal to have a $150 billion global industry, so it's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And everything they've built out, so they've, in China, they've massively facilitated the growth and adoption of artificial intelligence, more so than really any other country in the world. They facilitated government investment. They make it easy for people to grow companies, do research. They attract foreign researchers. They pay a lot of money for people, anybody who has specialized skill sets in AI. They've created entire towns and villages to create autonomous vehicles. So they've really invested more than I think any other country in the world really has. And in doing so, part of it's that they've laid out the digital infrastructure all across the continent of Africa. So the number one cell phone company, smartphone company in Africa in 2017 was actually a Shenzhen-based company, Transient Holdings. And a lot of these telecom companies, et cetera, they provide the infrastructure. So for last week we were talking about the privatization of the civic digital infrastructure, but we were talking about from a perspective of a U.S. company, privatizing the civic digital infrastructure of a U.S. city. Now it takes on a different perspective as you have a foreign entity laying out the civic digital infrastructure of a growing global South nation. So, for example, CloudWalk is working with the Zimbabwean government to implement CCTV cameras, smart financial systems, airport, railway, bus station security, and a national facial database. So remember again our lecture from week one where we talked about datafication, the collection of data, and how once data is formed, it is basically reusable almost infinitely. So just keep that in mind as we go through today's conversation. And also, if you look at the types of infrastructure initiatives I'm talking about here, these are all government services, right? So it's the digitization of government. But again, it's no longer the privatization by a company in your own country. It's now a foreign entity that's doing it. So what may be the implication of that? So this is a really great article from the Wall Street Journal. I think it was the video was linked in your readings for today. But it's about the content. It's called Continental Drift, but it's about the spread of specifically Huawei. So this is one company, one of many, and the number of surveillance projects and so which is obviously a little more insidious, but just offices and networking projects. In other words, putting in 4G and 5G into entire nations. And I suppose if you superimpose the two maps, you would have very little white space left. So this was an article from last year. So this data is current as of probably about middle to early of last year. So this is probably bigger than it was then. And again, this is just one company. This is just Huawei. But then, of course, you'd say, well, investment is good, isn't it? I mean, some of these nations are up and coming. They don't have this type of industry natively in their country. Isn't infrastructure and development good? Isn't investment good? Because it's bringing, it's enabling people to move into the modern economy, et cetera. And it's been proudly called the Silicon Savannah in different parts of in the rise of entrepreneurship in different cities in Africa. So it's by many people seen as a very good thing that there's this investment happening. So is this not a good thing, right? So I'm going to draw a little bit from my political science background and talk about something called the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty. And it kind of goes like this. So if you've ever heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, right, the Millennium Goals, et cetera, this guy, Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University, actually he was one of the two people who wrote this paper on the resource curse, I think in the 80s. And pretty much the general premise is that countries with an abundance of natural resources like oil and gas, diamonds, certain minerals, tend to have less economic growth, lower levels of democracy, and worse development than countries with fewer natural resources, right? So it's kind of odd. You're sitting on this pile of quite literal wealth, like raw materials. Well, you just got to dig into the ground and oil will spurt up. So why is it not leading to a happy, prosperous, functioning society? Because you should have enough money to feed everyone, make sure there are jobs, et cetera, public services. So why might that happen? So they coined this term. They coined this term paradox of plenty, and so they define resource-rich as countries which derive at least 20% of 20% of exports, or 20% of fiscal revenue from non-renewable natural resources. But what happens, and again, this is the paradox, is the flip side of it. About half of these countries are middle to low income, and what that means specifically is they have an extreme dependence on their resource wealth for fiscal revenues, export sales, or both, lower saving rates, poor growth performance, and a highly volatile resource revenue. So what does that mean? So basically what they're saying is that a lot of these countries that have these pure natural resources, diamonds, et cetera, it seems that they are so reliant on the single economy, the single product. It's actually kind of a bad thing. So if you invest in stocks, so you have a mutual fund, or so they always say, you've probably heard this phrase, diversify your portfolio, right? Don't put all your money into one thing. Even no matter how profitable or successful the company is, because if something happens at company stock, all of your savings will crash, right? All of your stocks will crash. So pretty much what happens that they're pointing out is that there's such a strong dependence on this natural resource, this natural good, that they are subject to the whims of the global market. So let's say your country is oil rich. Well, if the price of oil drops, everybody in your country is now going to be affected by this, that you don't have that resilience that you would if you had a diversified economy. And interestingly, because there is such free and easy wealth, there aren't high levels of savings. And it's poor growth performance, and again, the volatility that comes from the fact that they're just economically reliant on a single good or product. So what leads to this inconsistency? So one thing you do see is that there is a higher level of centralization of wealth. So remember I said that they had lower levels of democracy, higher levels of poverty, et cetera. So what leads to this inconsistency? So a couple of questions for us to ask. What is the system of government and governance? how trustworthy are these institutions? Who are these power players? And is there a global systemic infrastructure that incentivizes corruption? So this is not just about this one country and the resources in that country and the actions these individuals are taking, but it's also a wider narrative about what colonialism actually is, which is a global narrative of things that influence from one place that then impact the other. So it's also something called Dutch disease, and interestingly, this happened in Netherlands in 1959. There was a massive discovery of natural gas. What happened was it led to currency inflation, unemployment, and then the government actually had to intervene to combat this unemployment. So how that specifically happened, the market gets flooded with all of this natural gas being sold. Therefore, there's a lot more exchange of currency, and the currency actually devalues in the market. That then leads to people rapidly trying to cut jobs to save themselves some money because you're now seeing deflation of your own currency, leading to mass unemployment. And then the government actually had to, because this is also a country with good government services, they actually had to come in to limit unemployment, get people jobs, or create government jobs for individuals. So just an example of this is not just about a global South country, or this isn't like a cultural thing. This happens in Western countries as well. So one of the things we have to ask when comparing some of the countries that we're going to talk about with this Dutch example is to think about how the socioeconomic system is structured. So first we think about, so in most better functioning or more resilient societies, we have horizontal integration. So what does that mean? Horizontal integration is the notion of community interdependence and diverse economies. So in other words, for example, if you have an economy that is more diverse in nature, you, let's say, you're able to grow your own crops and make your own food. There has to be somebody who is a farmer, someone who is a miller, someone who is a baker, right? You have these different so it's horizontally interdependent. So people rely on each other. There's a network, and it ends up actually being a reliant community structure. It's also a diverse economy because you have people, if there are poor crops, and let's say wheat doesn't grow, it's okay because you maybe have other industries where people are making and building and selling other things. The other part to think of here is that wealth is earned in a decentralized manner. So rather than have monopolistic corporations running everything, there's a diversity of places one can work, one can make a livelihood, etc. And then I think the most important thing here is that different individuals have to get along to have a functioning economy. So again, back to this notion of, if you have an economy where you're able to grow your own food, you have multiple people in this value chain going from the planting of crops to the selling of bread. And all of these groups have to rely on each other and have to work together. Now, in vertical integration, which happens in a lot of resource-rich nations, so it's a zero-sum game. You only have X amount of oil, you have a finite amount of diamonds, right? Or you have a finite amount of whatever this thing is, and it's a land grab. So if you've ever read Upton Sinclair's Oil or seen the movie, what's the movie adaptation of Daniel Day-Lewis? There Will Be Blood. It's actually about an oil rush, and like when people, so if you think about the gold rush in California, all the oil rushes that happened, people were fighting each other because there is only a finite amount of wealth. Whatever you grab is yours. Whatever you don't grab, you're never going to get. So there is no interdependence on each other. You can just literally pluck raw materials out of the ground and just make money off of that. That leads to an incentivizing large corporations to be built because you essentially need reach and muscle, right? Because you need to push out anybody who's not you. So being bigger and more centralized is actually in your best interest. So you think about how the structure of these two economies, vertical versus horizontal, leads to a different style of economy here. And again, you have zero-sum incentives. So in other words, if I don't take it for myself, then someone else will take it, and this is a non-renewable resource if it's oil or gas or diamonds or whatever. And in doing so, redistribution of wealth only happens via taxation. So this incentivizes individuals to create big, massive monopolies or big, massive corporations because it won't help to have a bunch of little people in the room. You need sort of a big behemoth. But then in doing so, there's a centralization of wealth. So the only way you can redistribute the wealth is actually not by people going out and getting jobs. It's actually by heavy loads of taxation, which will lead to redistribution, because you've, again, privatized your natural resources and your economy's only source of income. So one case study I want to talk about, Gabon, where, and I do not know this case study incredibly well, so I apologize if there are facts I'm getting wrong here. But at a high level, in 1970s, oil was discovered, same characteristics of Dutch disease. So 80% of their revenue came from oil, and then there was an attempt at diversification. But even though there was a mass investment in education, there was a less than 50% secondary graduation rate. It also led to a centralization of patronage politics. In other words, you had a 24-year ruler being replaced by his son, and yet you had so many people living below the poverty line and high levels of youth unemployment. So it's the same sort of characteristics we saw. So it's a typical sort of Dutch disease case study. But there is, however, a rebuttal to the resource curse. So Dr. Amy Niang, who's a lecturer at the University of, there's no way I'm going to say that correctly, so at a university in South Africa, the foundations of this model were laid during colonialism, when imperial powers, through conquest and coercion, acquired sovereign prerogatives, from levying taxes and imposing customs duties to signing treaties and administering justice. So really what Dr. Niang is talking about is colonialism led to the eradication of culture and community, right? It led to the eradication of their natural, organically grown economy. And they did so to create an infrastructure that suited the colonizer, not the colonized. Right. So when there's a discovery of natural resources or oil and gas, which, by the way, there is a high overlap of resource-rich nations, particularly in the global south, and who was and was not colonized, or how controlling the government power was, right? The foreign government power was. It's difficult, if not impossible, to extricate colonialism from this notion of the resource curse. And one of the rebuttals here of the notion of the resource curse, that it inherently pushes the blames of essentially colonialism onto the colonized by saying, well, you guys just don't know how to govern yourselves, and that is actually a pretty common refrain. We heard from the colonizers to say these people are, quote, uncivilized, and we need to civilize them. So one of the rebuttals is this resource curse narrative is simply a rehashing of that same storyline. So one aspect that we didn't think about here, at least we didn't discuss, was the global nature of these economies, right? So if you are resource rich, you're not just selling oil and gas to other individuals in your country. You're resource rich because you're exporting it globally. And as I mentioned, one of the things that happens is your nation's economy becomes dependent on global ups and downs of this particular, the actions of which are often out of your hands. So what also happens is, because this colonized mentality still ends up existing, because the purchaser, in other words, the developed Western nation that takes the crude oil and refines it, is often the one in a position of power, and then you have this global South country that has the raw materials that are being taken away. And again, strong parallels to colonization. And one of the things that you find is that the ELF system, which is actually Europe's biggest corruption investigation since the Second World War, actually was linked to the corruption in a lot of these African countries, because they were serving as basically offshore money laundering places for the, quote, non-corrupt, quote, civilized countries in the West to park their illegal funds. So there was a global incentive to maintain unrest, whether political or economic, in these places, so that these Western nations could remain pristine and push off the negative externalities of what they were doing, their corrupt practices, to these countries that they had actually previously colonized. So when we think about resources and natural resources, et cetera, and economies in general, it's global. And it's interesting because we talk about how we are in an era of globalization, how technology has globalized us. But we have always actually been in a global economy. It is the very, very rare country, and there are actually often only isolated island countries that were cut off from a global trade. So it's interesting how we talk so much about globalization as if it's a fairly new phenomenon, but it's actually new iterations of old phenomena that have existed for a very long time. All right, so I told you this really great story, and you're like, okay, but I thought we were talking about AI, right? So what does this have to do with technology? So data is the new oil is probably a phrase you've heard, and it's quite a tired one. So one of your week one readings, actually it was not a week one read, I wanted to put it in, but I actually had to cut it out, and I may actually send it out as an optional reading. Marion Fourcade, who's actually at Berkeley, has a lot of really amazing, she's an economist, has a lot of really great papers on, I didn't put it in because it's a similar but less accessible read to the Sadowski piece of the notion of data as capital. So it's actually Fourcade and Healy, but specifically Fourcade, who frames data as capital. So in that, they talk about how modern organizations are now driven by a data imperative that demands the extraction of all data from all sources by any means possible. And that's probably a familiar refrain to you now after our week one conversations, right? That really like everything about you is taken, tracked, and stored, even if it's not necessarily useful information at the moment, because why not, right? We're giving it, so why not take it? But so one of the terms for it used to be data exhaust. So if you've read or heard of this book called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, it's a really great book. It's one can think of it as an economic history of Silicon Valley. And essentially she talks about how in Web 1.0, it was a lot of venture capital funding and unprofitable businesses until the bubble started to burst. And when it started to burst, there was a massive amount of pressure on all of these companies to figure out what their revenue solution was. And it was Google that cracked the idea, and particularly their economist, Hal Varian, who cracked the idea that this notion of like what they used to consider junk data, like data exhaust, was actually useful data to mine. So data exhaust is something like, well, it's stuff that we consider to be valuable information now, like your search history, the cookies, the tracking data, the personalization stuff. So all of that used to be considered useless garbage. They stored it, but they're like, I don't know, why do we need to keep this? But I guess we'll keep it. It was called data exhaust. But now it gets completely flipped, which is why it's interesting that we use the phrase data is the new oil, because we used to consider that same data to be exhaust, which is the garbage byproduct of data. Yep.
What's the lady's name you said? The lady, the author
Oh,
of the book?
Shoshana Zuboff, Zuboff. Surveillance Capitalism. It was a really popular book last year. I warn you, it's like 600 pages long. It's like literally that big. But it's a pretty interesting read. I will say it's an interesting read. And if you do read it, like there's a lot of critiques of the book, but I have an interesting perspective. So if you do read and you're interested, I would love to hear your perspectives on it. So we have this phrase, data is the new oil. It's been beaten to death, right? And that's why I called it and other such tired phrases. I think there was a moratorium on using the phrase data is the new oil after last year, because I actually haven't heard it in some months. But the thing about data that makes it different from oil is that it is not mined, it is extracted. So in order to extract it, you need to build and control the infrastructure. Here's where it changes. Right, so oil exists in the ground whether or not I mine it. Data does not exist until I create an infrastructure to measure it and capture it. In order to do so, I have to be like a Huawei, a Google, or a government. I can't just be some individual storing and tracking data at a massive scale. So that's really the big difference. That's a pretty critical difference here. So I mentioned earlier this notion of Silicon Savannah. So when we think about the development of the global South, one of the big things that is being pushed for is entrepreneurship. There are entrepreneurship grants granted by all the massive tech companies, every government, all the VC funds. The amount of flights that go from the Nordics into places like Nigeria and Kenya are massive, and there's a lot of investment. And as I mentioned, it was very proudly called the Silicon Savannah. I think I want to say it was in Nigeria, they had digital currency. So what we use is like Venmo. They had that years before we did, and it solved a problem because paper currency was dangerous to carry. But they didn't necessarily have an infrastructure like we did of just sharing, sending money, et cetera. So they actually created an infrastructure to send digital currencies to each other. It made life a lot easier. It streamlined a lot of their use of data. And one of the industries that came up was microlending. So back to Jeffrey Sachs. When I was at Columbia I was like around 2005, right? So mid first decade of the 2000s. And before then, like late 90s to around that time, this notion of microfinancing was like the big hot thing. And it was in part by this place in Bangladesh called Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus, who actually won a Nobel Prize in economics, I believe, for his work on it. Finca, which was based out of Central and South America. So this notion of microfinance, which the Muhammad Yunus would say, the way the story goes was he is an economics professor in University of Dhaka. He took his econ students out to like a poor village, and in having conversations with some of the women there, realized that most of them lived in a lifelong cycle of debt, but it was for such a small amount, something like the equivalent of $50. The equivalent of a $50 loan could get this individual out of debt and being self-sustaining. So that's where the notion of microfinance comes from. And actually, Kiva.org was actually a really great company. I've actually been putting money in there for actually almost 20 years at this point, now that I think about it. And there's a lot of really interesting, like an interesting rabbit hole to fall down to learn more about microfinance, not just from a structural perspective of what it is and how it helps or harms, but also the cultural implications, the gendered implications of family dynamics. Like I will tell you, by and large, you will almost always get your money back if you give it to a woman, no matter where you give it in the world. It's actually quite interesting. Like I'm trying not to make this like a male versus female gendered discussion, but by and large, what the data shows is giving money to low-income women, you will almost always get it back unless there is some sort of a massive tragedy or reason that she can't pay it back. And just obviously people with families are more trustworthy, et cetera. So another interesting thing about microfinance is it ended up being very difficult to scale because the enforceability of, so microfinance is essentially a very small loan that the individual was not required to pay back at a high interest. So there was an interest, if they could pay it back, they could. But if you didn't pay it back, it actually ended up in more like reputational harm. So they relied a lot on the enforceability of small communities and villages. So the most interesting part about microfinance was that people often paid their loans back because it was socially expected for them to. They couldn't just walk away and not pay back this loan. In some cases because they wouldn't get another loan again, but also in other cases that the halo impact of the reputational harm may extend to their family. So if you're someone's brother and they didn't pay their loan back, you may have a lower likelihood of getting a loan. So it ended up creating this community enforceability. But then that becomes difficult to scale, right? Because how do you then give money to complete strangers with no community enforceability? So like microfinance is a very, very interesting case study in moving something from a microeconomic framework to a macroeconomic framework. But here, what happened was there were companies that started to basically use the notion of microlending, Tala and Branch specifically, and give you like small loans over your cell phone. But the difference was you had to pay these loans back and there was an interest rate attached to it. And what ended up happening was that people ended up getting stuck into a cycle of perpetual debt. So they consistently owed these companies small amounts of money that they were constantly paying back. So, what is the difference between this and the microfinance and microlending narrative I just told you? So number one, these companies are all based in Silicon Valley. They're not local to Kenya. Interestingly, I had also interviewed to be the chief data scientist at Branch, which was actually started by one of the co-founders of Kiva. That was the only reason why I interviewed there. This was years ago, before anybody was talking about ethical use of data. So one of the reasons why people in the global south are often, quote, unbankable, and that they're not given loans is because you can't create a credit score for them, right? They operate in either a pure cash economy or a barter economy. They're a lot more self-sufficient in terms of growing their own food, et cetera. So how do you then create a credit score for people who don't, use traditional, use our methods of economic trade, right? So in order to create this credit score, I will specifically tell you what Branch did was mine all of the data off your phone. So when you got the app on it was a smartphone app. When you got the app on your phone, you agreed to share all the data on your phone. You also signed up usually through your Facebook or some sort of social media. It was almost always Facebook, because Facebook was and still is today very widely used in developing countries. And they mined all that data as well. So they used your Facebook data to create a network map of who you know, who you're linked to. If any of those people were in their database, their lending history would impact you. They could also pull out things like certain risky behaviors and use that to create a scoring algorithm. Yeah, when I was interviewing there, they were actually looking for people who were good at natural language processing. So what natural language processing is mining text data. So what they were looking for were people who could parse through, let's say, all the Facebook posts you put up and look for things like maybe good grammar, good spelling, negative statements, statements that implied like drug use or excessive alcohol use, and all of this would go into some sort of credit rating score. Interesting that this ended up being the test ground, because if you read some of the stories about customer scoring, et cetera, today in Western countries, these are the things that insurance companies are doing to us and will be doing to us. But it was, as usual, it's actually called innovation arbitrage. Often these things are tested out in lower income and lower regulatory countries. So unsurprisingly, Kenya's poor were the first to, quote, benefit from this, this notion of getting a fast, quick loan, even though they were previously considered unbankable, but it all came at a cost. And I really love this quote. It comes from one of the articles from today. Kenya's new experience of debt is worrying. It reveals a novel, digitized form of slow violence that operates not so much through negotiated social relations, nor the threat of state enforcement, as through the accumulation of data, the commodification of reputation, and the instrumentalization of sociality. What does that mean? So remember when I talked about how one of the critiques of the resource curse was that what colonizing nations did was completely get rid of your culture and your infrastructure. And what this app ultimately did was, instead of creating community-based forms of lending, bartering, and enforcing repayment, it completely eradicated those social ties. It said you don't actually have to go to your uncle and borrow $20, and then your cousin's going to be like, "Hey, you're going to pay my dad back," right? And it sounds silly, but these are social enforcement. It's not like these individuals didn't get loans. Of course they did. They just got them from each other. They got them from their families, their extended families, their neighbors. In a sense, it was the same notion of microfinance, right? It was this idea of you have community-enforced norms, you have community-enforced values. So what these apps did was come in and completely eradicate that. So why is it bad to eradicate? Not only is it cutting down community and social ties, it's also a more ruthless form of repaying. So, if you owe your uncle $20 and you can't pay it back, they're not going to hold it over you for the rest of your life. They'll say, fine, we'll let it go, or pay me back when you can, or, whatever. There is no way these apps are giving you that sort of leniency, and this is why you get stuck into a desperate position of perpetual debt or cyclical debt. So again, thinking through the recolonization, these companies sitting on, I think it was Spear Street in San Francisco, replaying the same colonization narrative that happened through England and France and all these other Western countries back into African countries, essentially all over again. Yep. Eradicating their community ties, and literally profiting and benefiting from it, like getting, whether it's venture capital money or the interest back from people paying their loans. So from an extractionary perspective, and let's not forget, they're getting massive, massive amounts of data. So the second case study I want to talk about in this notion of data is Zimbabwe and this company CloudWalk. So I talked about it a little bit in the beginning. So CloudWalk is a Chinese company that has agreed to set up the infrastructure for the government in Zimbabwe. So if you know anything about the government of Zimbabwe, it's not exactly a happy, well-functioning democratic society. This is a great quote. Past experience has also shown that the Zimbabwean government will use a legitimate excuse, for example, to, quote, preserve law and order as a guise to actually monitor and restrict citizens' online expression and behaviors. If you remember thinking back to last week's narrative about smart cities being about safety and security, and why that's a dangerous narrative. So this is a common refrain that oppressive governments will use. It's actually quite literally what's happening in Kashmir right now. I think yesterday they were on 100 days with no internet. The government shut down the internet, presumably because they want to slow down violence, they want to stop violent groups from congregating, but actually it's so that these individuals can't get their stories out, so that no one knows what's happening in Kashmir. It's a complete internet blackout. So they use this narrative, this excuse of preserving law and order in a, quote, unruly society in order to monitor and restrict citizen behaviors. So CloudWalk, as I mentioned, is laying out the entire infrastructure of safety and security, including like from everything, from buses and train stations to actually a facial recognition system. And part of the deal is actually to provide those images to this Chinese company. So why, right? So let's go back to the Belt and Road Initiative. China wants to be the dominant global power in AI. One of the things you need in AI is training data. And if you remember from what I said about Fourcade, data is not mined, it is extracted. And it's extracted if you create and own the infrastructure. So what they've done, and if China wants to be globally dominant, they need more than just Chinese faces. And if you follow the narrative on facial recognition, where it falls apart the most are on dark-skinned black faces. So this company makes a brilliant move, goes to the Zimbabwean government and say, we will absolutely do your infrastructure for you, but hey, can we keep that data? So this whole narrative of not just creating the infrastructure, right, owning the infrastructure, extracting it, and then utilizing it for their own benefit, and none of those resources will be seen by the Zimbabwean citizens. Those are the only people who are not going to see anything or actually benefit from this. So again, going back to the notion of algorithmic colonialism, right? It's the recolonization, it's the ownership of the means of production, the value of production, the raw materials, all of it by a foreign entity. So the third case today I want to talk about is Uganda, Zambia, and Huawei. So when you have a foreign entity operating, within another country, frankly, they're operating in a values vacuum, a norms vacuum. They have no idea what the culture, the society, the laws of that country are. So it's interesting because there's a more recent example that is actually about the US, where Twitter engineers were helping the Saudi Arabian government spy on dissidents. But this is an example from last year where Huawei engineers worked directly with the Ugandan government to monitor this guy. His name is Bobby Wine, his WhatsApp group. So this, there's a lot of controversy around Bobby Wine as a figure, et cetera, but all this is to say that this individual, who is a wildly popular potential candidate for president, was actually spied on by the existing government through the explicit help of Huawei engineers in order to arrest his supporters, to quiet his support, and in general try to squash his campaign. And this was actually legal under a 2010 law, which gives the government the ability, quote, to secure its multidimensional interest, which is a very broad and undefinable statement. It's kind of saying, well, if we think it's a bad thing for a government, then we can go do this. So mining their opposition powers' data, and again, doing it through a third-party foreign entity in order to do so. So as I mentioned, there's actually been a similar case more recently of Twitter engineers helping the Saudi Arabian government track and find dissidents as well. In Zambia, similarly, Huawei technicians helped the government access phones and Facebook pages of a team of opposition bloggers running a pro-opposition news website which had repeatedly criticized the Zambian president. And that actually ended in their arrest. So again, mining private citizen data and information because they own the infrastructure. And in doing so, they're similar to the smart cities narrative, shifting the balance of power, right? So there will always be opposition. There will always be a dominant power, but this technology, especially when it comes in through a foreign entity, is tipping the scales towards these autocratic regimes. So as I mentioned, from last week, just a reminder, the surveillance, or from the first week actually, surveillance ecosystem is more than just facial recognition. You have private or foreign actors controlling the civic digital backbone. So now I'm introducing this notion of foreign actors, not just privatized companies. So again, you have an infrastructure reliance. So we think about Zimbabwe, right? So now these governments, a lot of them are actually getting this infrastructure laid out for very cheap or completely free in exchange for this data. And from their perspective, they're like, that's fine. That's not costing me money because money is not what I have. Data is what I have a lot of, where actually I can't extract the data. So this is where it breaks a bit from the resource curse narrative, right? There is this raw material, which is data, but they can't create and control the infrastructure to extract that data. and they need this foreign entity to do so. So then they're similar to the smart city narrative, now reliant on this private company. So they have cloud-based data systems, online monitoring tools, even things like financial services. And again, as I mentioned, digitizing creates data. So what can we do? So one of the learnings from the resource curse literature, first is this notion of good governance, and second is horizontal economies, so creating economies that are not just reliant on one source. So from a data perspective or an infrastructure perspective, this would actually mean homegrown entities that are able to have some control over the data and infrastructure, decentralized power, competition, and diversification. So rather than having one company control all of the datafication or modernization of a city, having multiple competing powers, hopefully some that are local as well. And then how do you prevent the rise of surveillance states? So, and again, because I'm taking a more global perspective this week, so we're seeing it replicate in India, Ecuador, multiple cities in the US under a, quote, safe cities or smart cities initiatives. There are facial recognition bans in the US, and any sort of talk of the surveillance, they really can't just attack one of the technology. It has to talk about the ecosystem, and we need safeguards for our infrastructure. So one interesting case study to think through is the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance. So you'll have this PowerPoint up on Moodle. That blue part up there is a link to the actual ordinance. But essentially, it's requiring review of all technologies that are related to smart cities that could track. And they actually define surveillance technologies as those which observe or analyze the movements, behavior, or actions of identifiable individuals in a manner that is reasonably likely to raise concerns about civil liberties, freedom of speech or association, racial equity, or social justice. So specifically, it's talking about how a technology can have a chilling effect on what we would consider to be our privacy and our civil rights and liberties. The only thing that is not included in this, however, are police body cameras and any equipment considered to be necessary for office work. So while police body cameras, you can obviously see where that may be problematic, but so why did they exclude stuff that's necessary for office work? I am not quite sure, because workplace surveillance is actually going to be one of the most insidious ways in which people are tracked and monitored constantly. So, conclusions. Technological development of the Global South is potentially beneficial, but should not be blindly adopted. We can draw from this resource curse literature and to help frame the challenges, potential outcomes, and a path forward. And the key to preventing a recolonization of the Global South, but in this case it would be a technological recolonization or an algorithmic recolonization, is citizen empowerment, good governance, and horizontal systems of power. So I think with that, we have about 10 minutes for a break, and then Susan will have some comments for us. Great, thanks.
More or less. How's everyone? Anybody wants to know how I am doing? Sometimes people ask, how are you doing? Well, I'm exhausted and I'm flying on fumes, so it is a whatever day today. So what I thought, because I honestly had very little time, I thought what I would do was to pick out particular ideas from two texts that we read today. One would be Mirka Madianu's text, and the other one is the one that I picked out, which is Bert Olivier's text. And I think both of these texts bring a number of ideas together that have, I would say, broad relevance for the way you have listened and heard to ideas in this course. So I'm going to go pretty much almost page by page in a certain way, because that's all I had time to do. You will forgive me, I hope. So talking about Madianu's book, her essay, in which she wants to provide a definition for what she calls TechnoColonialism. A lot of what she's writing repeats or resonates with what Rumman has already presented to you. So there are ways in which you can find lines of continuity, but some of the references that she made frankly were very amusing. For example, as she said, this ubiquitous rise of hackathons, especially ones that have been initiated by that bastion of innovation and entrepreneur sensibility, the Vatican, because they had a hackathon in order to provide refugees with solutions to particular social problems. That made me smile. I don't quite understand how the Vatican understood what they were doing with that, but perhaps it was a hip idea that somebody suggested, and it actually happened. So that was interesting. One of Madianu's particular critiques is that humanitarian operations today are reproducing colonial power structures. And I thought that was apropos to a number of conversations we have here at PSR, which is, what does our own instinct for transforming and changing the world, what does that do if we become enslaved to that idea? It's a challenging idea. We want to do good in the world. We want to socially transform the world. What if we become enslaved to that idea? Does humanitarianism remain humanitarianism, or does it become an agenda for something else? And that is a very important idea for us to keep in mind as we completely devote ourselves to the task of social transformation. One reason why this happens, and what I thought was so interesting about this article that Rumman suggested for us, is that many of the sources that Madianu refers to are sources that I'm hoping you are reading in other classes and courses here at PSR. So if you haven't heard the name Anibal Quijano, I would say go and find that name quickly and understand the contribution this very important philosopher has provided for contemporary understandings of colonialism. And one of the critical ideas that Quijano provided for us is similar to the idea that Fanon articulated from the first week that we heard, which is colonial relations tend to reproduce themselves, even after the so-called historical decolonization has occurred. In other words, those of us who are social transformers and social leaders, how much of a self-reflexive humility should we have in order to keep a tab on our own agendas for change and transformation? Where would we find those voices or those sources that would help us question our own motivations? Because if our motivations come out of our desire for satisfaction, even if it is couched in humanitarian language, we are simply reproducing colonial relations. So, as leaders, and particularly as students of religion, that humility to approach the task of transformation with a great amount of skepticism as to one's own motivation is critical. So these sources are, I think, very useful for us. Another name that she talks about is Enrique Dussel. And this is an absolutely important name that you have to know, and I know many of you know and read. But he talks about how Western modernity really hides a dark side. This is an idea that Walter Mignolo, another name that you should know, picks up very much, is that modernity, for all of its benefits, its technological prowess, has a dark side. Among its dark sides is what Dussel calls the invention of the Americas. Now, I found this idea very interesting because what is America? In the political rhetoric that we hear today, in this so-called democracy, America is the name of one bounded land with borders so secure that no illegal or unlawful person should breach it. That it gets breached constantly becomes a matter of grave security concerns. But what is this America? You know, America is the name of a continent, that one particular nation takes that particular name and uses that name as a name for itself is a sleight of hand, and it constructs something. Colonialism constructed contemporary geopolitical realities. These realities didn't exist in another era. They are direct descendants of colonialism. So whether it is India or Pakistan, to use an example, or America and the Americas, they're all geographies that are a result of history. They're all geographies that are a result of history. Another name that she invokes, also very critical for us as critical thinkers, is the name Anne Laura Stoller, who has made a great impact on colonialism and post-colonial theory, especially by a phrase that she uses. And the phrase that she uses is, there is a durability to imperial formations. In other words, decolonization does not dilute or remove these particular imperial formations. They simply reproduce themselves. Sometimes they reproduce themselves by going underground, meaning they are not visible to us. And I think in the past 3 weeks, that's what you have heard with the datafication of our planet. What we are not seeing and what we are not watching for is exactly what Rumman has been talking about, which is these imperial formations that are reproducing themselves in a very covert way. So again, as students that are constantly questioning themselves and their world, these are ideas that are very generative, in my opinion. And here is a challenge. What do we do when humanitarianism or social transformation itself becomes an imperial formation?
Yes.
What do we do with that? I found today's readings, in as much as I was able to read them, most resistant in some ways to the kind of religious and theological analysis that I'm comfortable doing. But what I found to be very interesting was that even in order to make the critique of datafication and technocolonialism, these thinkers are drawing on a partner of theology from the absolute beginning, and that is philosophy. So we may not have many direct lines of resonance here, but there are very many direct conversations to be had with theology's ancient transdisciplinarity. And that brought me to another thought. While we are thinking all this, and as we have introduced this completely new sector to you as a conversation partner, what would change in theological imagination and theological thinking? That path has not been tracked yet for the future. We don't know. But here, the lines of continuity are here. And among these lines are some of these ideas that we're talking about. Modernity. We welcome modernity because we were able to slough off the shackles of, let's say, oppressive religion. But have we really? Especially when our humanitarian impetus hides a very old colonial logic. How do we bring ourselves to a self-reflective questioning? So in her reading, she offers a few ways to think about this, at least in the way that I was reading it. She said there are 5 logics here that complicate the thought about technology and humanitarianism. One of the logics is, or the first logic is, the logic of humanitarian accountability. And what this means is, for a lot of digital performers, digital platforms are seen as answers to the problems of neocolonialism. In other words, digitizing technologies are seen to be, in some ways, resisting forms of neocolonialism. She's a little bit skeptical about that. I don't know what you think about it after your reading of the essay, but that's what I got from it. Another one is the logic of audit, which she says is in direct contradiction to the logic of humanitarian accountability. Because audit implies that someone is watching how you are spending your time and money and resources. But if you're trying to push against neocolonialism, how exactly can you be audited? Because neocolonialism is many tentacled. It reaches far into the fabric of the way we live. So the logic of audit counters or contradicts the previous one. Another logic is the logic of capitalism. This, of course, is, as Rumman has pointed out many times, the unerring logic of our times. Everything is about profit, even when it is coated with a humanitarian perspective. So digital companies make many connections with the United Nations, for example, in order to provide aid and relief to various parts of the world, ostensibly. But in quite another way, they also sell that data or have that data for private companies that are using that data to rethink their branding programs. In other words, those private companies are very interested in that data because of the ever-present desire for profit. Again, how do we really need to understand this in its complexity. It isn't simple. Then she warned against the logic of solutionism. I thought this was a very challenging idea because right now at PSR, at least in faculty conversations that I'm part of, and I'm part of all of them, most of them, all but maybe like 1.5% of them, we constantly talk about a habit that we have fallen into. One of the habits of the Western Academy is that we are very long on what is called critical thinking. And what I mean by that is we spend a lot of time being critical. Not just critical, downright criticism. This is exhausting because nobody can do anything because someone's shooting it down. So what we think about as a faculty is, should we start thinking about solutions instead of constantly pointing to the problem? But here is a thinker who is actually militating against that and saying, I don't think so, this might be a problem because solutionism drives us to find very particular kinds of solutions to complex social realities, particularly technological solutions to complex social realities. This, she says, is creating a problem for us. It is creating a new subjectivity. Now, for a theologian, the word subjectivity is an immediate marker. It marks a number of discourses. We, in religion and theology and philosophy, are constantly talking about subjectivity. In fact, all of the ways in which we speak about identity or personhood are conversations about subjectivity. And here is this thinker involved in technology talking about these philosophical ideas that we know a lot about. Except for the first time in human history, we are producing not, let's say, theological subjectivity or philosophical subjectivity or contemplative subjectivity. We are creating entrepreneurial subjectivity. In other words, we are producing folks that are constantly looking for where's the problem and do I have a solution, especially a solution that can be monetized or marketed. And what that does is it provides blinders to us, because in the end, that only serves us, not really the social world that some of us say we are committed to. So again, I thought that this particular essay was very generative for me, coming in as a complete outsider, but looking at the sources she's reading and saying, well, I've read those sources, but I didn't read them quite this way. And the final thing that has a lot of, final logic that has a lot of resonance to what Rumman talked about today, and also in week 1, is what she calls the logic of securitization. We are addicted to security, especially after 9/11. Everything, especially the movement of people, has become a security issue. People have always moved, and people continue to move, but the idea is this: when the poor are on the move, they are a security risk. When the rich are on the move, they deserve it because they deserve a vacation, and they're great tourists because they have money to spend, and they can move, and they should move, but nobody else.
What's the notion of the expat versus the immigrant? Exactly.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice. This happens when I get very excited. So, the focus on security makes of the state, Tara, thank you. I know what you're going to do. Yes. I need water. So the state becomes a provider of security and ramps up the logic of security because there's a leisure domain, a sleight of hand. Nobody then needs to focus on its failures to provide for its people, because it constantly talks about security. So I thought that these logics, as she identified them, are very interesting ideas for us to pursue as we do our own work of social transformation here. The extractive idea, technology as extractive, and using whole cultures and groups of people in order to extract data from them, that is another idea that Rumman has talked about constantly. That kind of extractive datafication never benefits the group from which they are extracting data. It is always for the benefit of somebody else. This is the coloniality of power, again, that idea that Dussel and Quijano and others talk about, because it creates in the world the same logic that gave rise and sustained colonialism, which is Europe and Europeans are the owners and the rest of the world is what is owned. They own the rest of the world. This is a repeating trope and very, very highly problematic. But a sentence that completely caught my imagination in this reading and made so many connections for me, as I hope it will for you, is on page 10 of Madianu's essay. And she says, just like crisis data, biometric data are ontologically and epistemologically limited. For any student of philosophy and for any student of religion, thank you. God bless.
Everything was frozen. Okay, there you go.
No, thanks. And that was a little bit of ice. Now I'll choke on it and die. Tara knows my mood, so she forgives me before I say anything nasty. So, I mean, just imagine this sentence. From a social scientist, this is transdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary thinking at its best. Just like crisis data, biometric data are ontologically and epistemologically limited. If you reduce a human being to data, you have said very little about a human being. This is what I meant last week when I said, take away your arms, take away your legs, take away your eyes. Did we lose you? Of course, we lost your body. We did. And you lost your body. But is your body you? Maybe it's an Indian way of thinking in the world. But the idea is this: we are much more ontologically. We are not just our measurements, our data, or what can be seen on the outside. We are more. Where would we preserve that particular idea? It is a religious idea. It's a theological idea. How can we bring that idea to social scientists like Rumman and others who are challenging technology for a lack of attention to ethics, but maybe are not paying attention as much in the way we do about personhood, about humanity, about subjectivity? So there's your opening for you. If you were wondering, how does all this hang together and why are we thinking about it here in a seminary of all places? We are because no discourse has a handle on all of it. I would be so bold as to say, and I can because, I'm a dean and all, I can say this. I think religion, theology, and philosophy have a handle on the human being to a far greater extent than even medicine or anthropology, or in this case, social scientific data. In which case, why are we not in the conversation more? Yes. Why are they using our language? I mean, I shouldn't say it in this adversarial way. But I mean it. I mean that. I want to get your fighting blood off. Why do they speak our language and we are not in the room? That's my question. Bert Olivier is someone I had read and known before. And the sources that he uses are all people I read all the time. He also refers to Fanon. If you don't know by now, but I'm a very big fan of Fanon. The caution again to avoid trying to repeat the past and to have the vision and the bravery to imagine an yet unimagined future. Because Fanon is tired. Fanon, before anybody else, was talking about this idea. Even if we become independent, even if we become decolonized, we are human, and we're going to repeat the same mistakes. And hasn't that come true? I'm referring here to India, if you are under any doubt. Hasn't that come true? We wanted independence so much. We wanted to have the largest democracy in the world. It has not happened. The ardent desire to create a utopia, very, very dangerous, according to Olivier. One of the ways in which to think about this is with the question of identity. What kinds of identity should we have when we are trying to decolonize? There are three, according to his essay. There is legitimizing identity, there is resistance identity, and there is project identity. And in his mind, the only valid form of identity for decolonization is what he calls resistance identity. And this happens when people are actively pushing against colonial logic. And he tells the story of course, what else? A passage to India. So one of my all-time favorite novels, very complex, difficult even for an Indian to read, or I should say especially for an Indian to read, because it tells a story of confusion. I read it in 1982, so I was in college, and I remember puzzling over it thinking, I have no clue what this Englishman is saying. This is not a passage to India at all. But it was. It took me many decades to understand the story. One moment that captured the story for me is Adela Quested's entry into the Marabar caves. Now, this is an important moment because the caves are it refers to two things. One is India's own unwillingness to be known and to be captured and codified by the West. India always presented this deep, dark, inscrutableness to the West. So that's a metaphor. The cave is a metaphor for that. But it also plays with another idea that Western people are very fond of, and that is Plato's cave. Plato's cave is it's the opposite idea, that we are all locked in a cave, and in order to be enlightened, we have to go out of the cave. This is the exact opposite. In order to understand, you don't go out, you go in to darkness. And while the opening is receptive, it welcomes you to go in. Once you go in, you have to confront a truth. And the truth is simply this. It's what I said last week. You do not see things as they are. You only see things as you are. So Adela Quested goes into the cave, and then she comes running out screaming. Because what she sees, what she perceives, God knows what she felt, experienced, scared the very life out of her. But then, in a case of predictable, projective narcissism, she blames her Indian guide who led her into the cave, Dr. Aziz is his name, and claimed that he raped her. Now, this classic trope of, again, feminine intrusion, receptive openings, darkness that you have to penetrate, etc., is all catching, or raising issues that colonial encounters constantly faced, but didn't have the power to understand or grapple with. So read his explanation. It's really interesting to think about decolonization as a return to the darkness. One of the other ideas that he talks about is how the datification has another subjectivity that it is creating, and I thought it's a nice way to end because it resonates with something that Rumman also said today. The other side of datification is to create a new subject that can be controlled. But since colonialism is a little bit out of fashion and everybody knows what it looks like, now it is done in a very covert way. And the way that it is done is to create the indebted subject, the subject that is always in debt. They have the systems that exist create the subject, whether they want just one's basic human needs met, or whether they want, let's say, an education, or if they want to buy, whatever it is. We have become a culture in which data controls us through debt. And that's another view of this entire complication of complex that you and I have to pay attention to. Again, he refers here to sources that theology has drawn on for at least 200, 300 years now. He talks about this on page 12, I think. The indebted is the contemporary, non-dialectical counterpart of Hegel's slave. This is very interesting to me. Just as a sentence, I like sentences like this. It's a packed sentence. The logic of critical thinking has Hegelian roots. So Hegel's identification of a dynamic, which is the master-slave dynamic, is the idea that Fanon also develops, that the master needs the slave as much as the slave needs the master. It's a dialectical relationship, and therefore it remains, it is there. But with the indebted, this is an interesting idea. in the indebted, in the people that are now so much in debt, you have a contemporary counterpart that is non-dialectical. Your masters, our masters, do not need us. They've already bought us. We don't need them. What we need is our money. We have, however, no power. Because of how much we owe to them, we have no power in changing that dynamic. And that is, how to say, it's very, very grim. It's a grim picture of our reality. He also goes then to talk a little bit about security. Another thing that caught my attention in here, I think it's on page 13, he said, we have all become, in some ways, too much talkers. Look at how much time I have taken today. We talk too much. Maybe in this information glut that we are living, what we are missing is silence. Not the silence of acquiescence, not the silence of giving up, but the silence of waiting to think before one speaks and to make qualitatively better arguments rather than just saying everything that one knows all of the time. That's a lot of noise, and we are contributing to the noise. So that idea that we have to deepen our silences in order to speak as loudly as possible, very generative for theologians and religious scholars. So that's what I have. I'm sorry I wasn't able to collect too many things, but that was a bit. Thank you.
All right, wanted to open the floor for your discussion, questions. I don't have any specific questions prepared because I figured this is a topic that people would have a lot of thoughts about. So any questions in the time we've got left? Yeah?
Well, I just had a question come up for me from the readings that I was interested in perhaps hearing what other people had to say or just say out loud. And I don't have an answer to it. And I was interested in this notion of creating a new identity and the notion that we can't really, for those who are colonized, and perhaps now we're learning that that may include us, that we can't really go back to our attachments of our old traditions and our old ways of thinking about ourselves or our communities, because it was never inextricable from the colonized reality. And this call for a new identity that Fanon talks about, and just what the role of spirituality and religion is, given that it has been kind of had many permutations, but in a sense the old tradition, or at least in the view of others. So how to create a new identity of people who are aware, alert of the colonized realities that aren't going back to the old ways, and yet what role does spirituality have in the fruition of that new identity?
Do you want to take that one? I have some tangential thoughts, but I think she's asking a very specific question. I think you'll probably do that.
What do you say? What are you thinking tangentially?
So I was thinking tangentially, kind of, because you raised this in the context of colonizers and colonized. I always find it very interesting when this is actually a very white American thing to do, is to talk about being part something. Like people who were born and raised in New York will say they're like, oh, like I'm Italian, my Italian roots, or my German roots, but they've like, and actually where I'm from in New York, a lot of people like, I'm Irish, they're very proudly Irish, but they haven't been to, they have no concept of where they're from in Ireland, their family, etc., or maybe they've heard of some cousin somewhere. And it's interesting to know, who is allowed to be, to have these romantic ties to where they are from, even though they actually have no linkages, and those for whom it gets torn away, or it's something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. So it's interesting, this notion of being able to, quote, go back to your roots and who's allowed and who isn't. And actually before, when Susan was talking about the notion of the wealthy being able to move and travel, and people who are not wealthy not being allowed to. I don't know if everyone in the class heard me. I said it's like the difference between the definition of an expat and an immigrant. Poor people are immigrants, rich people are expats, right? Rich people go and become a, quote, expat in Singapore, and they're usually white Western nation folks. When my parents came here, they were immigrants. No one would call my parents expats. So what's the difference? There really is none, except for skin color and country of origin. So I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Well, that's a very interesting question, Malika, and I don't know if others have responses to that, but it reminded me of something that Gandhi used to say. Gandhi's idea was the British reduced us Indians to things. We will not treat them in that way. And so this idea of thingification, we do this constantly, and we do it in almost, without thinking. So how do we preserve the humanity of people, including those who are oppressors? And for religious people, that's a challenge. And I think in contexts that are suffused with what I want to call Protestant secularism. Now, I am a Catholic, so there's a little bit of bias here. But Western secularism, in many ways, is Protestant. And what I mean by that is there is a loosening of any, overarching structure that can mediate truth or even an answer to you, and individuals are responsible for their own beliefs and ideas, and all of that is classic Protestantism in a way. But there is also a tendency towards an either-or thought form. It's either this way or that way. The possibility of the muddier both and is resisted. So how do we say that the oppressor is both an oppressor and a human being? That's our challenge. We'd rather stay, I think, in the idea that they are oppressors, animals, and we are the poor, the oppressed human beings. So non-violent forms of spirituality aim towards preserving the humanity of even the oppressor. What would ethics and politics look like in that way? I'm not sure, because Gandhi's experiment didn't go very far and he wasn't successful, and it isn't successful in contemporary India. But the heart of nonviolent thinking is exactly that: preserve the humanity of all. Yes. Is it a minute?
I was just overwhelmed by all this tonight, and feeling like I was getting little pieces, but feeling like there were so many pieces missing because this is my first exposure, and I was feeling this yearning, and I wasn't sure what the yearning was for, and I was tempted to get political or sociological, or because I used to be a therapist, get therapeutic, whatever you call it. And I was like, okay, I'm studying theology, and we're supposed to, or we're invited to try and put our theological whatever towards this. So I was thinking, okay, if I'm going to try and be theological, what am I yearning for? And I was like, I think I'm yearning for cosmology with this, because I just can't get a handle on it. And then I thought of this play. It was a one-man show by this guy named Dan Hoyle, where he got a grant to go to Nigeria and study in a cosmological way, I don't know if you use that word, all the moving pieces of the oil colonialism that took place there, how it affected the soil, the animals, the people in the village, and he played 100 parts in this one-man show. It was a complete tour de force. And he's doing the same thing with the border situation right now. He's trying to present a cosmology, and I was just thinking, after hearing all of this, that I need art to to be thrown at this, to reflect it back to me in a cosmological way.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You. Okay.
Well, I found this very interesting, an interesting challenge, because on the one hand, I see the progress of AI moving so quickly. So it's like, oh my gosh, let's jump in and make some solutions. But then I also hear let's take a breath and make sure that we're not just kind of coming in with solutions that have been haphazardly put together without full reflection. The other thing that I see, I have an interest in pluralism and the change that has occurred in our country since 1965, when the Immigration Act changed, and I see that we now have a variety of religious institutions. I did some reading. There's an organization called the Pluralism Project out of Harvard, and the director of that indicated, because we have an ostensible separation of church and state, we also have no real training on how to utilize, faith traditions in terms of some of our solutions to society's problems. There's a challenge here. We don't want to have a church state, but yet we also there's traditions that are governing a lot of the things that we're doing that we are not really even defining. And I think this is because of this kind of challenge of these things. It's important for religious organizations like this to be doing some of the discerning, and having the kind of critical eye, but then also the innovative eye.
And I would also say, with what you were saying, William, a creative eye. So art, but art in its many forms. So you were talking about cosmology, and you were talking about what religion can do. Cosmology is a reminder to us human beings that we are not the ruler of the roost, that we are one part of creation. However, since we only read or see as we are and not as things really are, we read the stories in the Jewish traditions as if it's a story of our supremacy in the world. It never was. It was the story of God's supremacy. That whole creation story, 2 stories, those stories are about God's power and God's power to create this creature in a complex web of other creatures. Our status is creature. Our status is not angel or God. We are creature. That was the point of the story. Instead, we read it as a form of species supremacy. And that was a profound mistake. So what can religions do? Tell a story, tell the story again, differently, in the way that you are saying. Tell us the story of us being part of a universe, not masters and mistresses of the universe. We're not. Yes?
I'm reading the text. It's about renewing your mind. So on one hand, you go through whatever particular transition you go through, but you're still stuck with the same thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so how to combat that requires almost a daily acknowledging and being humble
saw Henry's. I don't think prophets have a choice. There's a problem. You see, you can't say that. I think I saw Henry, and then I saw you, and then I saw Henry.
I had an original thought with this question, but now it's not that with all this other stuff. But the whole idea of creating new identity, specifically in the context of communities in diaspora, specifically that whole idea of, just speaking from my context and my experience, what I'm struggling with right now is constructing a Filipino-American theology in relation to reading Filipino theologians. And so the question is, when I go back, like, there's this whole idea of moving back to my indigenous roots, but at the same time, what is the risk of me romanticizing that, or using a hard word like fetishizing my own roots, that it leads to some sort of inaction. And then for me, thinking about like the whole idea of the role of spirituality in that, a lot of the Filipino theologians I've been reading say this whole notion of being rooted in the struggle when it comes to this trans, or whatever ocean you are from. Like, there needs to be some level of solidarity between you and wherever you come from, but you also have to keep in mind that it's never going to be the same. And that's what I'm learning right now. Like, it's never, I can never go back 100% to my roots. There always has to be something new, and me focusing on it now. So there's that whole idea of, I need to be more comfortable in this both and aspect. Seeing towards the future, but also looking back. And spirituality has to address that both and aspect somehow.
I think you touch on a really interesting point, like even the romanticization of folks like ourselves, like you or me, and I was born and raised here, this notion of going back to our roots when actually we are all just as equally from here and have a claim to being from here. I don't know if you were born here, but I was, or if you were raised here for most of your life. I think most of us can say we can lay claim, and there is this notion of, you know, sort of appropriating what is due to us, being from where we are raised and not just where our family's roots are from. And what you actually reminded me of, for sort of personal anecdote that also links to a very interesting sort of literary link. So I'll give you my personal anecdote part of it. I've hated most South Asian literature for a very long time, and I really never knew, I didn't really understand why. You know, I thought that I should really love, you know, a lot of the rise of South Asian authors, etc. And I would read these books and I thought they were just fucking awful, sorry. They were just so bad. And I couldn't really put my finger on what I thought was so bad about them. And a lot of them were written by British authors, by, you know, Western educated, so it's, you know, so then I teach this class at UCSD called Power and Justice. And in that class, we read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And if you've not read that book, it's just one of the most powerful, amazing books about the Black American experience. And so I TA'd that class before I taught, and one of the times I was being TA'd, the professor shares a story about how Ellison was very highly criticized by other Black authors when the book came out. And they said, well, it portrays negative portraits of Black people. This isn't like Native Son, where, you know, we have to show that we are a noble people, that we're a good people, and that we have these, you know, we're not animals. And his response, and I always remember this. I'm like, and now I understand why I did not like a lot of these South Asian authors. What Ellison's response was that you all write for white people, I write for Black people. So in introducing negative characters, he was introducing the complexity of the human experience, not the Black human experience, the universal human experience. So the reasons why I disliked most South Asian authors was they wrote for a non-South Asian audience. So everything is like the smell of jasmine wafting through the windows as the, you know, and it's like, you know, like that's not our lives. Like, you know, we don't wake up in America thinking about, you know, the smell of whatever my mom
Or in
used
Bombay.
a candle, right? Like that's just life. That's just how things smell. It's not exoticized. So I think kind of what you're touching on is like a trap that we often fall into is the exoticization of our own roots because we are trying to validate our own existence through the lenses of other people. So to say we are worthy because we're writing this for you to see us as worthy versus bearing the ugliness of what it is. So.
That's great.
But if you've not read Invisible Man, like seriously, it's one of the best books I've ever read in my life.
Kristen, you have this?
Yeah, just super quick. I actually wanted to respond directly to your question, which I just love. And I just love explorations of cosmology, so thank you too. I feel like the cosmological algorithm is in nature, and like such a profound act of resistance would be to apprentice to plants. Because plants are also transmitting massive amounts of data through deep, deep, deep networks. And it just feels like, you know, we're so in the realm of machines and data that's like swirling in front of our faces all the time that we can't see, but there is this like massive original network that feels like a cosmological algorithm.
So actually, one thing oh, sorry, go ahead. One thing I was actually literally reading this article today. You can find it in MIT Technology Review. It's the top 10 breakthrough technologies of 2020. And the first one was actually quantum internet. So you're just talking about how like nature has this network. There are scientists actually who have, they've already built this. It's a quantum internet, which uses the notions of quantum entanglement theory and atomic particles to share and distribute information across an information pipeline. So right now they actually have an internet that exists through it. So it's part of it's based on research that came out of China, but it's actually been developed as a functioning internet in the Netherlands at TU Delft. So to your point about like there is this cosmological network, and now we are actually tapping into it. So the benefit of a quantum internet actually is unhackable because of quantum entanglement theory. If somebody views this data who's not supposed to be accessing this information, it'll disturb the particles, and you'll know. So to your point, like that's actually according to the article, their projection is by the end of the decade we would have a worldwide quantum internet, a wholly unhackable internet that's essentially based on nature. Yeah.
I think there was a hand, Nadia, and then Johan.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the TechnoColonialism as something evil that produces this imperial formation. But I'm thinking about the challenge we have as future leaders of organizations and religious institutions. Because at the end, everything as we do is involved in technology. I can see in my church how they spend a lot of money with software, with wireless, and even us, when we need to buy a computer, our colonized mind is, math is better, even if it's very expensive. And to me, it's like technology privilege the big companies also. In the 90s, I remember about the 90s when Windows was the booming, and the other open sources like Linux was very cheap, but nobody wanted to use Linux because Microsoft was like a lot of publicity, like, and to me it's like as religious leader, I need to think in alternatives, not only to think that a big company like Google or Microsoft has the better, software that I need.
So the question of monopoly, monopolization.
Okay, one more.
Johan?
And I feel that exhausting because exhausting is not because of my statement now. That is just like
Oh goodness, I mean, I think this is where we start talking about the massive imbalance of power. There is no way for me to do it, and even if I could, what would it even mean to them, right? And you know, I realize it just hit 8 o'clock, and I don't want to end the class on like technological doom and gloom. But to your point, like of quite little, and this is where things like regulation come in, right? So actually this past week, the European Union has released their guidelines, their white paper on artificial intelligence. You can take a look on, you know, what the EU is thinking about, you know, and not just in terms of, you know, regulation and controlling, but also in terms of investment, right? Because this is still, it's such an amazing opportunity if it's done right. So I think there is a goal to do that. So I do need to end. I'm looking like I'm wearing a watch. But I can answer your question afterwards.
Actually, I have another thinking instead of this answer, and I think this is a very good answer.
Sure.
And when we think about this monopoly, they use all your data, and they want to make sure they exactly know what you want, your behavior, and they worry about losing their market like that. And I think if we compare with the personality, I feel that this is marginal personality. So if we today, like the church today, we are facing this case, how could we prepare ourselves? So that's why I agree with your answer about when we in today's society we need art, we need something else, we need some nature of relationships. So I think if we can thinking about taking care of ourselves, especially taking care of the relationship and quality in the church or in the neighborhood, we might have more energy to know how could we deal with or how could we facing or using this situation in the world. So I think if we could consider of a group of people, they have that personality. I mean the company. They have that personality. Maybe we should thinking about how could we use the force of a group of people, which is the church, or which is our group, our community, or like professor, you are doing your research, and I think maybe you should thinking of that way to deal with this problem in today's society.
Great. So that's a very positive way. Thank you for ending the class. So we'll see you all next week. We have a really wonderful guest speaker lined up, Vina Dubal, and we're also going to be doing an interactive workshop and exercise. So thank you, and see you all next week.
Thank you.